say we're going to get close to the time to open up the questions to the audience. Actually, kind of just wanted to turn it back to you guys. The conversation started in one place and it ended in another. Is there anything that you guys would like to revisit from the earlier part? Anything you feel like you didn't get a chance to offer? Okay, then I'll have one more question of my own then. In terms specifically for new and emerging artists, is there anything that you can recommend in terms of publications that they should just be aware of and reading as artists?
That's a tough one.
It is a tough one.
Maybe Chicago specific.
Well,
sports.
every one of our venues. But I think the real answer is that you want to know. I guess it depends on what kind of artist you are. Like I know a lot of artists who are not very interested in participating in their local art world, and I know a lot of artists who are sort of happy to kind of spend their lives in their studio and totally disconnected from a scene they're a participant in. So, or kind of remain periphery because they feel like all of that stuff gets in the way of their work. So it's hard to say. I feel like it's incumbent upon you as a young artist to feel like you should be a member of that community. You should know what's going on. You should feel like you're a participant, and you should feel like you have some ownership over that community. So I feel like you should read everything you possibly can about that community, right? You should know what's going on. But those resources change all the time. So it's sort of, read us, obviously.
Yeah, I think it's good to be aware of. Particular magazines, nothing comes up except for Prompt, which was this amazing magazine that was published by somebody in Chicago, I'm forgetting who, but sadly it went away. But maybe it'll come back at some point. But otherwise, be aware of the discourse of your field. That if you're a painter, I'm trying to think of, you should have you should know what people are talking about when they refer to Raphael Rubinstein's provisional painting essay in Art in America recently. Not that you have to sign up for that or whatever, but it's one of those essays that actually has the impact of kind of being a touchstone for a conversation about painting that is pretty extensive, right? In other words, most painters can kind of feel that they belong to some kind of shared enterprise by talking about that one essay. And the same would be true with the discourse around, the reemergence of drawing. That was not so much like this or that essay as a number of essays, but also this one show that the Drawing Center did in New York, I think 2 years ago. Right, the reemergence of drawing is this incredible, like the new queen of the arts in a way. Just kind of know where the different strands of the conversation are, and be involved in that. It's harder nowadays because the art world, like a lot of sectors, is so fragmented. But there is still a professional coherence. There's still a set of magazines. There's CAA. There's different things that kind of give you a sense of like stock taking or reports from the field, and be up to date. Again, if I wanted to come back to one thing, and it would be one way to kind of really know what critics do and to kind of feel our pain, just as a lot of us have come up through BFA and MFA programs and felt your pain. Try your hand at it, like Vito Acconci and Laurie Anderson and Mel Bachner and Donald Judd and so on and so forth, who didn't just write essays. They did that critical grunt work of going around to galleries and writing reviews month after month after month after month. They beat the pavement. then it's really easy to talk to critics. You know, we sit there and share war stories. And
We're kind of at a, at a time when doing that is maybe easier than ever, just in the sense of what the function that the blog performs and the ability to be read at least by your small group of friends, and some of those blogs rise up. So maybe that's actually, anyone have any recommendations on some great art blogs that we should follow?
Chicago Art Review.
I find that they go, my problem with a lot of citizen journalism is that it's almost never edited. It's almost, it's rather ephemeral. To me, it would be like when we used to stand around in the Rainbow Club talking about the art world in my day. It's almost like a conversation. It doesn't have quite the, and maybe that the times are changing, and what I used to think was substance is now considered to be snooty and uninteresting. But I find things that are unedited to be risky. I don't invest as much time in them as I do in sites that tend to be a little bit more controlled by somebody or other. I look at Bad Sports every week, usually on Sunday night. Sometimes not till Monday morning, but usually on Sunday night I will check Bad Sports to see who they interviewed that week. I don't always listen to the whole thing, but I do. I found you could play it while you're doing something else. So Bad Sports is something that I never miss. And there are a couple of other sites that that are sort of criticism discussion areas that I will look at both locally and nationally. But I like print. I still like the smell of it. I like the feel of it. I like the permanence of it. I like the tactility of it. And that's just some ode, as we say.
Well, and somebody should mention that that New City does an incredible job of covering a really big, like they cover more of the shows in town than anybody else. So, so they are always worth checking out. So.
All right, let's take the last bit of this to open up discussion to questions from the audience. I don't know if I carry this around. I feel like Oprah, maybe.
Hi. I'd like to address this question to all of the panelists in terms of what is good art to you when you're reviewing a show? What are your criteria according to your own aesthetic, and what do you look for?
I'm going to have a blanket response, which is that I do not have a recipe. And I think it would be incredibly boring and predictable if I did. And I actually thought about this question on the way here and realized there's probably more in common in the work I don't respond to than the work I do respond to. And I'm going to leave it at that, because I actually, I'm glad that I feel like I can't pinpoint a really concrete response to that kind of question. And I would actually, if I could, really not want to say it to artists either, because that would seem really prescriptive.
Well, and for us, our venue is really dialogue based. So so I look for things that I am interested in having a conversation about. So for me, I, like Lori, have no idea how I would characterize that, but I look for things that that prompt me in interesting ways, and I feel like I can have an interesting and useful conversation around.
We used to say that there were two kinds of critics, and there was the critic that was aligned to a group or a movement, like Dennis Adrian and the Imagists, or Catherine Hickson and the Neo-Conceptualists, and they were the writers who kind of championed a group and were really skilled at understanding the aspirations of that group early on, and played an important role. And then there are the critics that take all comers, that simply say, and I've always been in that I like to think of myself as in that group. And they're both right. They're both, Dennis and Catherine were doing what was in their heart and in their intelligence to do the way they function. And you could argue that Clement Greenberg did the same thing for the Avex people or something like that. I always just ask myself, what is this artist trying to do? How well is he or she doing it? And is it important to me? And the third is the least important of those things. I always argue that my job is to describe and interpret and evaluate, but really describe and interpret, to give the artist verbal voice at some point in the review. And you usually find that while you're doing that, you kind of get what they're trying to do. It's not what I would be trying to do, maybe. It's not what I would, if I just was walking past the gallery and just glanced at it. It's not things that I would engage with. But generally speaking, artists are trying to do a good job and trying to communicate some platform about their existence. And I try to give that a kind of verbal voice. At the end of the day, you do have to make some kind of evaluative or judgmental kind of intervention within it. But I think a good artist is an artist who is successful at what he or she is trying to do. And I don't care if it's still lifes of flowers or, performance art or monsters in outer space. I don't particularly care. Do it good, do it new, do it fresh, do it with conviction. And usually a viewer can cotton on to that conviction.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's absolutely right. I would want to say something else, but in the end, Jim's right. I mean, I guess I would want, if I could, I would want to say something like that. And maybe this is true to a certain degree, that I want to be as opened up. I mean, this is one of the distinctions that I think exists between critics and other kinds of professionals, maybe art historians or others, not necessarily, but is that, my experience as a critic is that you're kind of on the art world's clock more than anything. You do have to consider everything that's being put on the schedule by galleries, other institutions that are exhibiting, and so on and so forth. And you're kind of open to anything that comes down that pike. Unlike if you're specializing in this area or that area as an art historian, you can kind of narrow things down. And you can, one of the reasons a lot of critics, in my experience over the years, go to back to school and get the degree is because they're kind of sick of having to constantly run their lives according to the art world clock and have an opinion on everything that the art world deems exhibitable. But I do think that I'm not going to be completely open. That I want to come back to work, or have tried as a critic, all critics do, to come back at the work with a force adequate to it, right? And to assume that I'm just a kind of a blank slate would be inadequate to the artwork. And so one of the joys of reading somebody like Jim is that he's got such a developed kind of sensibility. He's got this really historied, very exercised response matrix, so that he can give an incredibly nuanced, detailed, but also experienced, deep kind of like reading on things. I do feel like there is a grain to things that I like or don't like at a certain moment. I currently am having a lot of experiences kind of blanching at work that I find is too easily romantic, because I feel like the dominant grain today in the ideology of our times is with prosumers and DJs and more mechanisms that allow for personalization and customization of things, that we all see ourselves as unique, that everything is now post-rock and alt this or that, and we're all blazing separate, unique trails of experience and so on and so forth, and we're all kind of like romantic heroes, when in fact this is just the latest way of telling the tragedy that is capitalism and so on and so forth. So I tend towards a more tragic art or a more comedic art. And I think so I can sit there and try to generalize about why I think certain things are certain sensibilities are inundating certain sectors of the art world at certain times, and why. And I can feel like it is righteous, or it is a scam right? And an indication of how we've been hoodwinked. So I can generalize about things, but in the end, it is true what Jim's saying. You never know when somebody's going to actually blow your socks off, and that's how it goes.
More questions? Just raise your hands and I'll kind of go around. Oh, come on, do you want me to ask more questions? Okay. Somebody else raise your hand so I know where to go next.
Hello. So I was curious about if any of you ever write about artists writing criticism, or look at artist criticism as work and then write about that. So if it was the '60s, would you be interested in a conversation with Smithson's Passaic monuments, or are you interested in that conversation now, working with that conversation?
Wait, you need to keep the mic because I have a question back to you. So instead of an example from the 60s, how about an example from now?
Okay, so would you be interested in writing about what Bad at Sports does? Or that's an example. Would you be interested in writing about an artist book that is full of criticism of other artists, something like that, or of artist-run space?
So for us, I'm sure at some point we will have a conversation with Lori about being her like lone gunman art critic, the 60-second art critic jam. So yes, but I mean I feel like there's so few. I feel like there's so few people who are really, like the job of art criticism and how it relates to journalism precludes that conversation most of the time. Because you're not really being a good journalist, you're not really making something useful if you're using that as an artist to kind of contemplate the form of X, right? And so only in the most earnest cases can you really go through and say, okay, well, this is both contemplating its form and earnestly delivering its content, right? So Lori's a good example there when she takes her art critic jam on the road. But I think that she's the only one I can think of offhand that does that in a way that is both really earnestly engaged with the task at hand of being critic and or journalist, and also producing something that's interested in the form that it's taking.
Yeah, I would just answer, of course. To give two examples off the top of my head, I've written in response to particular arguments put forth by, say, Michelle Grabner locally, or somebody I used to work with, Tom Lawson at CalArts. Also written about their work as artwork, and also written kind of like in catalog contexts about their practice. So both their writing and their art, but also their jobs as teachers, all as one kind of thing.
You write about it as a godly?
No. No, I write about it as a practice that, like, so if you, for example, one of the interesting things about Michelle's writing is that, especially early on in the 90s, there were certain things that she did that were kind of explicitly feminist arguments about art. But it was a kind of feminism that wasn't Shulamith Firestone, it wasn't anti the family, it was actually a kind of a feminist analysis of family structures. And so you look at that in terms of her artworks, which are all about especially early on, the domestic sphere, about using things that she'd find from like the dish rags and stuff to kind of use as the matrix or template for her pattern paintings. There was this kind of great continuity without it being explicit between the practice of painting and the practice of writing. And I think it carries over to her notions of community in general, which definitely fold the teaching work into it. So, same with Tom Lawson. I mean, there's these kind of connections. I wouldn't want to collapse them all into one thing. That would be unfair to what the kind of greatness of their undertakings, you know, how complex they are. But, you know, I don't think that if the writing stands up, you know, really well, then there's no reason why you wouldn't just kind of take it as writing and have to respond to it as a writer, you know, because it's kind of out there, it's jogged the whole discourse in a certain way, you have to respond. You're now in a different kind of world because it entered that world and had an impact. And the same with their art, of course.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you had mentioned that Art Forum did the worst of the year and now that's gone. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on how maybe ad sales has affected what you are able to publish and how much agency you actually have in what you could say, or how you approach writing a certain article for those kinds of major publications.
Did you say ad sales?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
ads.
Okay. That to me is one of the biggest misconceptions in my entire career, which is the pervasive belief that advertising in a publication guarantees coverage of some kind. And I've been at this for 30 years, beginning with the New Art Examiner, whose founder and publisher is sitting in front of me. And I've worked for Art Forum and Tema Celeste and Glass and all these different magazines, and it is completely untrue. There is a firewall between advertising and editorial. Now, will an ad in the magazine, will the editor see the ad and say, oh, well, it looks like an interesting gallery, and might it put you in the conversation a little bit? But and once or twice I've even said in a pitch to Art Forum, I said, you may notice they had an ad in the last issue when I'm describing, and they never even respond to that. So as far as in my professional experience, zero connection. You take an ad in the publication, it guarantees you nothing except the visibility that the publication will give your career. If you put a work of art in, that might be helpful to you as well. But I've had absolutely has no influence on me. It has no direct impact on whether a show will be covered or not.
Yeah, it's funny because just to reiterate this, the magazines where there is not enough money, they're too poor to erect a proper firewall. And I've worked, when I was in my 20s, I worked at some of these where I was both the editor and I had to go out and drum up ads, you know, and they are now being heroicized. You know, I'm asked to kind of come out of whatever, the mists of time and write something about editing this little teeny magazine and what a do-it-yourself kind of great operation was. And it was like always just like nail-biting conversations with gallerists where they're like, you want to talk about me running an ad? Let's talk about you running an article. And I'd be like, okay, let's see. I can't do that, you know, and then but you'd have to explain this each time, and you know, and then we'd come out with something that had 28 pages rather than 48 because people were like, you know, you don't play, we don't pay. We're not going to do it. Art Forum would never do that. That would be the end. I mean, that's how magazines die, is when they don't realize, when they don't have at least they're not able to propagate the impression that they have a proper firewall. One of the interesting things I think about Art Forum is to take all of the things that they have done that people point to as evidence that they've sold out, and so you could just do the last 15 years, and actually read them as, well, if it's not a straight up thing about having the advertisers run the operation there, then what else would explain it? So one of the things that people point to, other than taking the worst off of the best and worst of the year segment, was that they started running ads more and more. They started running more product ads, where they used to kind of put a lot of the product ads in the back of the magazine after the gallery reviews, you know, stuff for mints or airlines or financial services or eyeglass makers. And now they would run them in the middle of the magazine, but they also started to alternate ad and content, or ad and editorial, page to page to page, which they never used to do. Right? It used to be, I mean, that was a figuring of their firewall, was that you had the ad section, then it promptly stopped. Then the editorial started, it promptly stopped, and then the last couple pages were a couple more like really, tangential, marginal ads, and then you're out. Only in the 90s did they start mixing it up, and now it's crazy. But I don't think it has anything to do with the power of the advertisers. What it does is it fragments the magazine, so that you do not expect to read it cover to cover with anything like a smooth continuity, so that it can go from one think piece. I wrote about this in Chicago Art Review online. Again, this is where I publish my stuff, in case you have to go way down. It fragments so that it's a much more informational, so that you can sift through it rather than feeling like you're reading something like a book or a journal, like an academic journal or something like that. You go back in the 60s and they're much easier to read through, 70s also, cover to cover. They're pretty smooth. But now, how do you go from a Benjamin Buchloh Teutonic kind of like critique of some book and the book reviews thing to the next thing is the hot list or top 10 or something, or a report about this curator being fired here or hired there? You need it to be a lot more discontinuous, and that's what the mixing of the ad and editorial achieves.
We have time for about one more question, I think, or unless it's your time now. Okay, we're going to go with one more.
Oh, I just have a quick one. What's the best way to approach, provide information about an upcoming show to your senior editors? And really, James, you probably
Say it again.
to approach your senior editors. What's the best way to approach them with information about an upcoming show?
To approach my editor?
Yeah, and also James.
Well, it would do no good to approach my editor because he has no control over what I write. You have to approach me.
Directly to you.
Yeah. My editor has never once sent me any advice or information about an exhibition.
All right. Thank you.
And in my case, and of course, in any case, almost all the magazines have websites. The websites, of course, they have a masthead as well. They will usually list the reviews editor, so that's the person that you are trying to get the attention to, although certainly in an email you can send it to more than one. It may be a little harder to get the exact email of that person, but that is the person who has the authority to assign the reviews. So for the magazines I write for, they're easily accessible.
Probably physical mail would be best, right?
Email or physical mail would be best. I can say in one or two, very rare in my career, but in one or two cases, an editor will say to me, this is in the olden days when we used to get on the phone together, which we almost never do now, would say, oh, I got a card about such and such a thing, and would ask me questions about it. And but I don't know why they make the decisions. If I pitch 12 shows to Art Forum and they pick one, they never tell me why they picked the one that they picked. So I don't know exactly if it was something I said, if they went to the website and looked at an image or two, or if they threw darts at my proposal. I don't know. They never tell me why they picked the one that they picked. But it's the reviews editor is the person to target.
I am actually getting the word that we're going to try to close on time. So
Great.
thank you for coming, and thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
I just wanted to quickly introduce myself and say a couple of things. Just to first thank Christina and Jacqueline, our wonderful interns in the back. Our interns, we couldn't live without them here at CAC. And to thank Stacia and the panelists for making their way out in this snow to me in Miami. And it's still harrowing to go outside when it's like this. But thank you so much for coming out. I think it was a very thoughtful discussion, and I think it offered a lot of practical advice, which is what we always really aim to do here at CAC, is give artists more and more tools to professionalize themselves, and ultimately we hope we're doing a good job. We always want feedback and constructive criticism ourselves, so always feel free to come back and let us know what you think about these programs. I want to thank Courtney, who put today together and worked hard to make it a very interesting panel. And I invite all of you to go downstairs and check out the Bolt residency. Many of our residents are here today, and their open studios are downstairs. It's a new program that we started in June, and we have 2 shows that just opened last night. So thanks again for coming out, and enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Oh.
There's a seminar, one-day seminar at NIU on the 28th. It's about the Essential New Art Examiner, which is an anthology that has just been published. I invite you all to attend, and I will guarantee you that the questions that you have asked, there's a whole day in which there will be explicit, incisive, and penetrating discussion about all the aspects of the art world. Thank you.